The date is October 27th, 1962. Deep in the sweltering waters of the Sargasso Sea, a Soviet Project 641 diesel-electric submarine, designated B-59, is being hunted. The temperature inside the steel hull is a suffocating 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide levels are rising, the crew is passing out from heat exhaustion, and the deafening crack of American practice depth charges is hammering against the hull. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, cut off from Moscow for days, believes World War III has already started on the surface. He orders the special weapon to be readied. That weapon is a T-5 torpedo armed with a 15-kiloton nuclear warhead, roughly the same yield as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. In our timeline, a man named Vasily Arkhipov, the flotilla chief of staff, talked the captain down and prevented the launch. But what if he had failed? What if the stress, the heat, and the explosions had pushed Savitsky over the edge, and that nuclear torpedo had slammed into the hull of the aircraft carrier USS Randolph? Welcome back to the channel. If you want to dive deep into the gritty, unfiltered realities of military strategy, tactical analysis, and alternate history, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and join the ranks. We analyze the hardware, the logistics, and the human factors that dictate the fate of nations. To understand how the world arrived at this hair-trigger moment, we have to peel back the layers of strategic posturing that defined the early Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis did not happen in a vacuum, nor was it simply a spontaneous act of Soviet aggression. It was the culmination of a high-stakes chess match that began the moment the atomic smoke cleared over Japan in 1945. For over a decade, the United States held an overwhelming, almost untouchable advantage in nuclear delivery systems. We had the Strategic Air Command, built from the ground up by General Curtis LeMay, operating under the doctrine of massive retaliation. LeMay transformed SAC-CAC into a relentless, clockwork machine capable of turning the entire Soviet bloc into a radioactive parking lot within hours. By the late 1950s, the United States was flying B-52 Stratofortresses on continuous airborne alert under Operation Chrome Dome. These massive bombers, with an 800-mile range and a payload capacity of 70,000 pounds, loitered near Soviet airspace 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was acutely aware of its own strategic vulnerability. Despite their propaganda boasting of missile factories, turning out rockets like sausages, the reality was far more grim for Moscow. The Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, knew that his strategic rocket forces were practically hollow. Their first-generation intercontinental ballistic missile, the R-7 Semyorka, was a logistical nightmare. It was a massive, ungainly beast that required hours to fuel with highly volatile liquid oxygen, meaning it could not be kept on alert. In a preemptive strike by the United States, the Soviet ICBM fleet would be wiped out on the launch pads before they could even finish fueling. The strategic imbalance reached a boiling point in 1961 when the United States deployed Jupiter intermediate-range ballistic missiles to Izmir, Turkey, and to sites in Italy. The Jupiter missile had a range of 1,500 miles and carried a 4-megaton warhead. From Turkey, these missiles could reach Moscow in just 16 minutes. It was a dagger, pressed directly against the throat of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev famously complained that he could see the American missiles from his vacation home on the Black Sea. He needed a way to level the playing field, to give the Americans a taste of their own medicine. The opportunity presented itself 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Following the disastrous CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, Fidel Castro was terrified of a full-scale American military intervention. He practically begged Moscow for protection. Khrushchev saw the perfect geopolitical maneuver. By placing Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, he could simultaneously protect a vital communist ally and bypass the American early warning radar systems facing the North Pole. This operation, codenamed Operation Anadyr, was a masterpiece of military logistics and deception. Between July and October of 1962, the Soviet Union moved a massive expeditionary force across the Atlantic Ocean. We are talking about 40,000 troops, thousands of vehicles, and dozens of ballistic missiles, all transported in the cargo holds of merchant ships. To maintain operational security, the Soviet troops were told they were being deployed to the Arctic. They were issued skis, heavy winter parkas, and felt boots, only to find themselves suffocating in the holds of ships bound for the tropical Caribbean. The CIA completely missed the scale of this buildup. American intelligence analysts saw the construction of soccer fields at Soviet military camps in Cuba and assumed it was just a standard advisory mission. It is a classic intelligence failure, reminiscent of the French High Command ignoring reports of German armor massing in the Ardennes forest in 1940. You see what you expect to see until a U-2 spy plane brings back high-resolution photographs of SS-4 Sandal ballistic missile erectors sitting in the Cuban jungle. Let us look at the terrifying order of battle as the crisis reached its zenith in late October 1962. The disparity in raw, apocalyptic firepower between the two superpowers was staggering. The United States military was operating under PSYOP 63, the Single Integrated Operational Plan. This was the master blueprint for nuclear war. If the balloon went up, the United States was prepared to launch roughly 3,200 nuclear weapons against 1,060 targets across the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe. The American nuclear triad was fully operational. On land, the U.S. Air Force had 156 ICBMs, primarily Atlas and Titan missiles, sitting in hardened silos and on launch pads. At sea, the U.S. Navy prowled the depths with 144 Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missiles. In the air, SAC had hundreds of B-52s and B-47 Stratojets fully fueled, armed with Mk-28 gravity bombs and waiting for the go code. The United States military was at DEFCON 2, the highest alert level short of actual war. Missile crews in the Dakotas had their launch keys inserted. Bomber crews sat strapped into their cockpits on the tarmac. Engines idling, ready to take off within 15 minutes. Against this monolithic American war machine, the Soviet strategic forces were drastically outgunned. The Soviet Union had roughly 20 ICBMs capable of hitting the continental United States from their own soil. Their heavy bomber fleet was small and highly vulnerable to American air defenses. This is exactly why the Cuban deployment was so critical to Soviet strategy. The group of Soviet forces in Cuba, commanded by General Pliev, was an incredibly lethal and heavily armed tripwire. Pliev commanded 36 R-12 medium-range ballistic missiles, known to NATO as the SS-4 Sandal. These missiles had a range of 200 miles and carried a 1-megaton warhead. From their launch sites in San Cristobal, they could obliterate Washington, D.C., New York, or the Strategic Air Command headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska, with virtually zero warning time. But the strategic missiles were only one part of the equation. The ground forces in Cuba were equipped for a brutal, grinding conventional defense, backed by tactical nuclear weapons. Pliev had 4 motorized rifle regiments, heavily reinforced with T-54 medium tanks, anti-tank guns, and artillery. The airspace was protected by a dense network of S-75 Divina surface-to-air missiles, the same SA-2 systems that had shot down Francis Gary Powers over the Soviet Union in 1960. Even more terrifying was the presence of 80 FK-Air-1 Meteor cruise missiles, equipped with 14-kiloton nuclear warheads, alongside lunar tactical rockets known to the Americans as Frogs. These weapons were designed to wipe out an American amphibious landing force on the beaches. If the United States had executed Plan 316, the planned full-scale invasion of Cuba, the Marines and airborne troops would have charged straight into a nuclear meat grinder. What makes this situation strategically unique is the command and control architecture. In the United States, the authority to release nuclear weapons rested solely with the president. But the Soviet military command structure, hampered by the massive distance and poor communication links to Cuba, made a fatal concession. General Pliev was given pre-delegated authority to use tactical nuclear weapons against an invading American force if he was cut off from Moscow. Think about the sheer insanity of that doctrine. A local battlefield commander facing thousands of American paratroopers dropping from the sky, and a massive naval bombardment holds the keys to the nuclear threshold. It is the equivalent of handing a frontline infantry captain the power to initiate the apocalypse. This command disconnect is exactly what brings us back to the naval blockade, or the quarantine, as President Kennedy carefully called it. The U.S. Navy Second Fleet, under Vice Admiral Alfred Ward, deployed Task Force 136 to enforce the quarantine line. This massive armada included aircraft carriers, cruisers, and dozens of destroyers. Their mission was to stop, board, and inspect any Soviet vessel approaching Cuba. But lurking beneath the waves were 4 Soviet Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarines. These were not strategic missile subs, they were attack boats sent to protect the Soviet merchant fleet. The American anti-submarine warfare doctrine at the time involved dropping signaling depth charges. These were essentially underwater grenades. designed not to destroy the submarine, but to bang on the hull and force it to surface for identification. But no one told the Soviet submariners about this signaling protocol. To Captain Savitsky aboard the B-59, the explosions rocking his boat were not a polite request to come up and talk. They were acts of war. His batteries were nearly dead, meaning he could not stay submerged much longer. The air scrubbers were failing, and his crew was dropping like flies in the unbearable heat. The tactical doctrine of his navy dictated that an attack must be answered with maximum force. He turns his launch key. The political officer turns his. The torpedo tube doors open, flooding with seawater, as the targeting computer locks onto the acoustic signature of the American fleet above. A blast of high-pressure air forces the 533mm T5 torpedo out of the bronze tube of the B-59. The weapon's electric motor spins to life, propelling the 4,000-pound steel cylinder through the pitch-black water at 40 knots. Unlike modern wire-guided torpedoes, the T5 is a straight-running, fire-and-forget weapon relying on an active acoustic seeker to find its massive target. It takes less than 3 minutes for the torpedo to close the distance to the surface fleet. At a depth of 100 feet, directly beneath the keel of the anti-submarine aircraft carrier USS Randolph, the hydrostatic fuse triggers the detonator. The conventional high explosives compress the plutonium core, initiating a runaway fission chain reaction. In a fraction of a millisecond, 15 kilotons of nuclear energy are unleashed into the Caribbean Sea. The physics of an underwater nuclear detonation are fundamentally different, and in many ways more devastating to naval vessels than an airburst. The blast creates a rapidly expanding bubble of superheated, incandescent gas, displacing millions of tons of water. This generates an underwater shockwave that travels at roughly 800 feet per second, slamming into the hull of the USS Randolph with unimaginable kinetic force. The 34,000-ton Essex-class carrier does not just sink. Its keel is instantly snapped in half, and the lower decks are crushed inward like a stepped-on soda can. A massive, hollow column of radioactive water, known as the base surge, erupts from the surface, shooting thousands of feet into the air. This column collapses outward, creating a rolling tidal wave of highly radioactive mist that washes over the escorting destroyers, the USS Connie and the USS Beale. The sailors on the decks of these destroyers are instantly coated in a lethal dose of irradiated seawater, their electronics fried by the localized electromagnetic pulse. How does a fleet commander even begin to process the sudden blinding flash of a nuclear detonation in the middle of a routine blockade? Vice Admiral Alfred Ward, aboard his flagship miles away, watches the horizon light up with a second sun. The radio frequencies, previously buzzing with anti-submarine patrol reports, dissolve into dead static. The quarantine has failed, and the threshold of nuclear combat has been crossed. Word travels up the chain of command at terrifying speed, from Sinkland headquarters in Norfolk, Virginia, directly to the Pentagon, and finally to the desk of President John F. Kennedy. The doctrine of the era, leaves no room for de-escalation once American forces have been vaporized by a nuclear weapon. The response must be swift, overwhelming, and absolute. Kennedy authorizes the immediate execution of Oplan 312, the massive preliminary air campaign, to be followed instantly by Oplan 316, the full-scale amphibious and airborne invasion of Cuba. The skies over Florida erupt with the deafening roar of afterburners. At Homestead and MacDill Air Force bases, hundreds of tactical aircraft from the Tactical Air Command are launched. We are talking about waves of F-100 Super Sabres, F-105 Thunder Chiefs, and Navy A-4 Skyhawks. Their primary targets are the Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missile sites in San Cristobal and the dense network of SA-2 surface-to-air missile batteries protecting them. The American pilots are flying low-level ingress profiles, skimming just 100 feet above the waves of the Florida Straits to stay under the radar horizon of the Soviet early warning networks. But as they pull up over the Cuban coastline to acquire their targets, they enter the lethal engagement zone of the S-75 Divina air defense system. Let us analyze the terrifying reality of facing the SA-2 in 1962. Unlike the pilots over Vietnam a few years later, these American aviators do not have radar warning receivers in their cockpits. They have no electronic countermeasures, no chaff, and no flares. They are flying blind against a radar-guided missile that travels at Mach 3. The Soviet fan-song radar paints the incoming strike packages, feeding targeting data to the V-750 missiles. The SA-2 is a massive two-stage rocket, 35 feet long, armed with a 430-pound fragmentation warhead. It does not need to hit the aircraft directly. The proximity fuse detonates the warhead 100 feet away, filling the sky with thousands of jagged steel fragments traveling at supersonic speeds. The skies over Havana and Pinar del Rio turn into a chaotic, flaming furball. F-100 Super Sabres are shredded mid-air, their fuel tanks erupting into fireballs that rain down on the sugarcane fields below. It is reminiscent of the 8th Air Force flying unescorted over the flak-filled skies of Schweinfurt in 1943, but at Mach 1 on the deck. Despite taking heavy casualties, the sheer volume of the American strike force overwhelms the Soviet defenders. Napalm 500-pound general-purpose bombs and 20-millimeter cannon fire rake the Soviet missile sites. But the intelligence failure of the CIA comes back to haunt the Pentagon. The Americans are bombing the known, fixed sites. They are completely unaware of the highly mobile tactical nuclear weapons hiding under camouflage or netting in the dense jungle canopy. With the air campaign raging, the invasion force hits the beaches. The 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions, backed by naval gunfire from heavy cruisers, storm the beaches at Tarara, just east of Havana. Simultaneously, the skies darken with C-130, Hercules, and C-124 Globemaster transports. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions are dropping thousands of paratroopers into drop zones aimed at cutting off the capital from the western provinces. This is the largest amphibious and airborne assault since the invasion of Normandy. Over 100,000 American troops are converging on an island defended by 40,000 heavily armed Soviet regulars and 100,000 Cuban militiamen. The American plan relies on rapid mobility, pushing M48 Patton tanks and mechanized infantry off the beachheads to seize the strategic airfields. But the terrain of Cuba is a logistical nightmare for heavy armor. The coastal swamps, the dense humidity, and the narrow winding dirt roads of the Sierra del Rosario mountains force the American columns to bunch up. They are creating massive, slow-moving targets. Deep in his underground bunker, cut off from Moscow by the severing of communication cables and the atmospheric interference of the naval nuclear blast, Soviet General Issa Pliyev realizes the invasion has begun. His orders are clear. If American forces land on Cuban soil and communication with the Kremlin is lost, he has the pre-delegated authority to use tactical nuclear weapons to defend the island. Pliyev gives the order to the commanders of the 2nd FKR Regiment and the Lunar Rocket Battalions. The FKR-1 Meteor is a terrifying piece of early Cold War engineering. It is essentially a cruise missile built around the fuselage of a MiG-15 fighter jet, powered by a Klimov turbojet engine. Launched from a mobile trailer, it has a range of 100 miles and carries a 14-kiloton nuclear warhead. The lunar rockets, known to NATO as F-Frogs, are unguided, solid-fuel tactical rockets mounted on heavy, tracked amphibious chassis. They have a shorter range of about 20 miles, but they also carry 14-kiloton warheads. The Soviet missile crews, operating in the sweltering jungle heat, fuel the meteors and elevate the launch rails of the frogs. Their targets are the American beachheads at Tarara and the airborne drop zones inland. Do you think a Marine rifleman, trained to fight conventional infantry, has any conceptual understanding of what is about to hit him? The FKR missiles streak low over the palm trees, their turbojets screaming. Over the beachhead, where thousands of Marines are unloading supplies, securing perimeters, and staging M48 tanks, the first 14-kiloton warhead detonates. The results are beyond human comprehension. The thermal radiation flash, reaching temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun, vaporizes the first wave of infantry on the sand. Landing craft, utility vessels, and Amtraks are melted into slag. The overpressure wave, traveling at the speed of sound, flattens the jungle for miles, picking up 50-ton Patton tanks and tossing them like children's toys. Simultaneously, the frog rockets impact the airborne drop zones. Paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne, still descending in their harnesses, are incinerated mid-air. Those who had already landed find themselves in a landscape of radioactive glass and burning vegetation. This is the carnage of Okinawa or Iwo Jima, condensed into 4 seconds of blinding light and thermal radiation. The tactical situation for the United States military collapses instantly. The M48 Patton tank, the workhorse of the American armored thrust, has heavy cast steel armor to stop armor-piercing rounds. But in 1962, it does not have an NBC overpressure system. It has no positive air filtration to keep out radioactive fallout. The tank crews who survive the initial blast waves are forced to fight in heavy, suffocating MOP gear, or they simply begin to die from acute radiation sickness within hours. The logistics chain, the lifeblood of any American military operation, is completely severed. The supply ships waiting offshore to unload ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies are forced to scatter to avoid the radioactive fallout drifting out to sea. The beachhead is a highly contaminated dead zone, meaning no reinforcements can land. The surviving American units, scattered, irradiated, and cut off from command, are subjected to vicious counterattacks by Soviet T-54 tanks and Cuban infantry fighting on their home turf. The T-54, with its low profile and 100mm rifled gun, excels in the close quarters ambush tactics required in the Cuban mountains. The Soviet motorized rifle regiments, trained for combat on a nuclear battlefield, exploit the chaos, rolling through the irradiated zones to wipe out the isolated American pockets. The invasion of Cuba has failed, transformed into a radioactive slaughterhouse in less than 24 hours. Reconnaissance aircraft, flying high above the mushroom clouds covering the island, relay the apocalyptic imagery back to Washington. The tactical nuclear threshold has not just been crossed, it has been shattered into a million pieces. The Soviet Union has wiped out an American fleet element and incinerated tens of thousands of American troops on the ground. In the subterranean depths of the Pentagon and in the Oval Office, the realization sets in that conventional warfare is no longer an option. The doctrine of massive retaliation dictates that an attack of this magnitude on American forces must be answered with the full, unrestrained might of the United States strategic arsenal. The keys are being turned in the missile silos of the American Midwest, and the bombers of the Strategic Air Command are receiving their final authentication codes. The emergency action message, a string of alphanumeric characters, crackles through the headsets of B-52 commanders loitering near the Arctic Circle. This is not a drill, and the sealed authenticators, cracked open by the flight crews, match the broadcast codes perfectly. The single integrated operational plan, PSYOP 63, has been triggered. Across the American Midwest, from the wheat fields of North Dakota to the plains of Kansas, heavy concrete silo doors slide open on their steel tracks. Deep underground, two-man missile crews have simultaneously turned their launch keys, initiating the irreversible firing sequences for the Atlas and Titan I intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Titan I is a massive two-stage liquid-fueled rocket, standing 98 feet tall and weighing 220,000 pounds. Because it uses liquid oxygen and RP-1 kerosene, it cannot be stored fully fueled, meaning the crews have had to pump thousands of gallons of highly volatile propellant into the missiles under immense time pressure. Within 15 minutes of the President's order, the first American ICBMs roar out of their silos, riding columns of blinding white fire into the upper atmosphere. Their target packages are pre-computed, inflexible, and designed for maximum counter-force and counter-value destruction. Simultaneously, the Strategic Air Command unleashes its airborne alert bombers. Hundreds of B-52 Stratofortresses and B-47 Stratojets push their throttles to maximum continuous power, turning south across the polar ice cap towards Soviet airspace. Each B-52 is carrying a payload of Mk-28 thermonuclear gravity bombs, weapons with variable yields of up to 14 megatons. To put that into perspective, a single Mk-28 possesses nearly 100 times the destructive power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Half a world away, the Soviet early warning network, rudimentary and prone to false alarms, detects the massive thermal blooms of the American missile launches. Premier Nikita Khrushchev, deep inside a hardened bunker beneath Moscow, realizes his geopolitical gamble has just signed the death warrant for the Soviet Union. He orders the immediate launch of all available strategic rocket forces. But the Soviet strategic arsenal in 1962 is a paper tiger compared to the American juggernaut. They have only a handful of operational R-7 Semyorka and R-16 ICBMs capable of reaching the continental United States. The R-7 is a logistical nightmare, requiring hours to fuel, and many are caught on their launch pads, vaporized by incoming American warheads before they can even ignite their engines. However, a few Soviet missiles do manage to clear the atmosphere. 30 minutes after launch, the re-entry vehicles plunge back through the thermosphere at Mach 23. An R-7 warhead carrying a massive 3-megaton payload detonates 8,000 feet above Washington, D.C. The thermal flash instantly vaporizes the Capitol building, the White House, and the Pentagon, turning the marble monuments into radioactive dust. The overpressure wave, exceeding 20 pounds per square inch, flattens every residential neighborhood within a 10-mile radius, snapping reinforced concrete structures like dry twigs. How does a nation sustain a war effort when its entire chain of command, its political leadership, and its primary communication hubs are wiped off the map in less than an hour? The answer is, it does not. The United States government fractures into isolated, subterranean remnants, operating under the continuity of government protocols, but completely cut off from the operational military forces. In the Soviet Union, the devastation is absolute. The American COP-63 does not just target military installations, it targets the industrial and population centers of the entire communist bloc. Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and dozens of other cities are struck by multiple overlapping nuclear detonations, designed to ensure target destruction even if some missiles fail. The Soviet industrial base is erased from existence, and the resulting firestorms consume thousands of square miles of surrounding terrain, sucking all the oxygen out of the atmosphere. When we analyze this apocalyptic scenario from a strategic perspective, the most glaring failure is the doctrine of massive retaliation itself. Crafted by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles in the 1950s, this doctrine left the president with only two options in the event of a Soviet attack: surrender or total nuclear annihilation. There was no flexible response, no graduated escalation, and no mechanism to contain a localized tactical nuclear exchange. This rigidity is eerily reminiscent of the Schlieffen Plan, implemented by the German Empire at the outbreak of World War I. The German war machine in 1914 was locked into a rigid railway timetable of mobilization that could not be halted once it began, forcing a localized conflict in the Balkans into a global slaughter. Similarly, the PSYOP of 1962 was a mechanized doomsday device that, once activated by the tactical events in Cuba, stripped human decision-making from the equation. On a tactical level, the disaster in Cuba highlights the catastrophic danger of pre-delegated launch authority. By giving General Issa Pliev the keys to the tactical nuclear arsenal, Moscow surrendered control of the geopolitical narrative to a local commander operating in the fog of war. We can compare this to the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, where Confederate General Robert E. Lee lost contact with his cavalry commander, J. E. B. Stuart. Without reconnaissance and direct control, Lee's forces blundered into a decisive engagement they were not prepared for. In Cuba, the breakdown of communication between Moscow and Havana meant that Pliev, blinded by the chaos of the American invasion, made a localized tactical decision that initiated a global strategic catastrophe. From an intelligence perspective, the CIA's failure to identify the Soviet tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba ranks as one of the most fatal blind spots in military history. The U-2 spy planes meticulously photographed the large, fixed SS-4 strategic missile sites, but they completely missed the highly mobile FKR cruise missiles and Frog rockets hidden beneath the jungle canopy. This is the ultimate danger of confirmation bias in military intelligence. The Americans only looked for the weapons that threatened their homeland, ignoring the weapons that threatened their expeditionary forces. Logistically, the invasion of Cuba under a nuclear umbrella was a doomed concept from the start. Amphibious operations require absolute control of the sea and the air, and a continuous, uninterrupted flow of supplies over the beach. When the Soviet tactical nukes vaporized the American beachheads at Tarara, they instantly severed the logistical umbilical cord of the invasion force. You can look back at the American amphibious assault on Tarawa in 1943, where a disruption in the landing craft timetable due to coral reefs almost resulted in the Marines being pushed back into the sea. Now, replace that coral reef with a 14-kiloton nuclear blast that melts the landing craft and irradiates the supply dumps. The surviving American armor and infantry, cut off from fuel, ammunition, and medical evacuation, were essentially left to die in a highly contaminated environment. The economic and environmental fallout of this exchange would permanently alter the trajectory of human civilization. The electromagnetic pulse generated by the high-altitude detonations would have fried the vacuum tube electronics and power grids of both nations. The United States industrial heartland, from the steel mills of Pittsburgh to the automotive plants of Detroit, was targeted and destroyed, instantly reverting the American economy to a pre-industrial state. Millions of tons of irradiated soot and ash injected into the stratosphere by the burning cities would block out the sun, triggering a rapid drop in global temperatures. This early onset of nuclear winter would destroy crop yields across the northern hemisphere, leading to global famine and the collapse of international supply chains. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not just a diplomatic standoff, it was a mechanical trap waiting to be sprung by a single human error. The military hardware, the logistics, and the rigid doctrines of the early Cold War created an environment where a localized tactical misunderstanding could escalate into global suicide in under 60 minutes. We survived the 13 days of October 1962 not because of a flawless command and control architecture, but because a handful of men, sweating in a submarine and pacing in the Oval Office, chose to ignore the rigid military doctrines they were supposed to follow. In the brutal calculus of nuclear warfare, the only winning move is ensuring the weapons never leave their silos. Now, I want to hear your tactical assessment of this historical flashpoint. What do you believe was the single greatest strategic failure that almost pushed the world over the edge in 1962? Was it A, the Soviet Union pre-delegating tactical nuclear launch authority to a frontline commander? Was it B, the CIA completely missing the presence of mobile tactical nuclear weapons in the Cuban jungle? Or was it C, the rigid, all-or-nothing American doctrine of massive retaliation that left no room for de-escalation? Drop your answers and your analysis in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button to keep the military history flowing and stay sharp.